Hey everybody, wake up. Let's Wake Up with Mark Joyner, episode number 86, and today we will discuss why trending topics trend. All right, so this morning my guys sent me a list of news topics that are trending right now. And one that stood out for us was that there is an article that's trending that says, it announces Amazon is selling a bracelet that will make you eat less fast food. And I thought, well, now that's interesting. That's interesting. I'm curious, what's this all about? And I dig into it, and it turns out it's about the Pavlok. Now, the Pavlok has been around for many years now. It's a rather ingenious device. It is a play on the word Pavlov, having to do with Pavlovian conditioning. If you remember, every time Pavlov would ring the bell and associate the sound of the bell with feeding the dogs. If you'd ring the bell again, even if there was no food, the dogs would salivate, right? So it's all about, what B.F. Skinner called operant conditioning. So the Pavlok is this device that you wear around your wrist, and you can set it up so that it will shock you when you do certain things. In fact, if you hook it up with IFTT, you can set it up so every time you go to Facebook, it will send you a shock. Don't do that. That would be awful. That would be awful. All kinds of interesting things you can do with the Pavlok. It's an interesting device. But that's not what we're talking about today. What we're talking about today is why trending topics trend. Why is it that this topic, which is not really new, is suddenly, being broadcast as new? How is that happening? Remember back in the 1990s, NBC had kind of a lock on television at the time, and they had this thing called must-see TV. And it was every Thursday night they had Friends and Seinfeld, and then a couple other shows that weren't as popular usually, and those kind of rotated in and out, right? Now here's the thing: they would have an on season and an off season, and in the off season they would say, well, it's not new, but if you haven't seen it yet, it's new for you, right? That's kind of clever and cheeky. But here's what's really interesting about that is that is a totally true phenomenon. If you haven't seen it, it's new to you. So the Pavlok, while not new, they can still create the impression of newness to people who haven't yet heard of it. Now you need to look at this through two different lenses, right? One is through the offensive lens. If you are a marketer or a salesman or a business owner or anybody who is involved in the selling of anything, you need to understand these phenomena so you can exploit them to sell more of your stuff. Okay, it's perfectly legit as long as you're selling people stuff that's of legitimate value. Don't use these tools to trick people into buying stuff that doesn't do what it promises. Okay, to me, that's where the clear line needs to be drawn. Within that, I think that there's a lot of room for a little more art. There's a lot of artistry in marketing. A lot of the time we go way, way over the bounds. There are a lot of people who are totally deceptive and lie. Pharmaceutical industries are probably some of the most egregious. All right, people selling food are probably some of the most egregious. And they don't do it overtly. They don't tell you that eating this food that's actually going to kill you is going to make you healthy. But what they do is they associate images with it that connote healthiness. So for example, whenever you watch a fast food commercial or a junk food commercial filled with very attractive people with lots of sexually suggestive stuff going on, they're creating deep unconscious impressions in your mind that associate that food with those different types of positive, desirable things. Very insidious. Okay, but sometimes the artistry goes way off the other end, and sometimes they just outright lie. Okay, and they tell you that you're going to get a benefit that you're not actually going to benefit. But personally, I think we have a responsibility as business owners to tell the truth. If you're selling food that's going to make people sick, Don't go creating the impression that it's going to make people healthy. I think that's bad for society. Ultimately, it's probably going to be bad for a lot of the people involved too. Yes, they may profit for a time, but I do believe that things like this are getting their comeuppance. People are starting to wake up to things. Now, the other lens through which you need to look at this is the self-defense lens. Okay, so when you are exposed to articles, you got to understand that the people writing these articles, and this is all of them, by the way, including the stuff in the most hallowed journals, all right, a lot of this stuff is written with an agenda. At the very least, it is written with someone's individual perspective. I question whether true objectivity is even possible for a human being with the limited amount of information processing capability that we have. So far as we know, we can only hold around 7 plus or minus 2 bits of data in conscious memory. How is it that we could be truly objective with such a narrow ability to handle conscious processing? I don't think it's possible. I think it's possible. I think we can endeavor, but I'm not sure if it's even possible. So you got to look at it through that lens as well. Now, on top of the fact that it's perhaps impossible to be objective, you got to understand that a great percentage of this stuff out there is written deliberately to persuade you. Okay, and if you don't believe that's true, really look into it. Okay, go Google the term astroturfing. Look up Operation Ajax. Find out what the CIA did to the Iranian media. Start looking into those rabbit holes. You'll find that that particular case was not a sole case. All right, now to give you a brief overview of that, the CIA sent people in to bribe journalists to create fake protests to get the Iranian people to rise up against their democratically elected leader so that we could install the Shah. We had what is known as blowback from this in the form of the Islamic Revolution, which gave us the Iranian government that we have now. If we had not meddled, it's very likely that they would have remained more stable, right? It's very likely that our intervention went in there and caused more problems than we profess to solve. And by the way, as a side note, a side note here, it's interesting when politicians like Tulsi Gabbard are being criticized for their anti-war stance, when they're telling her, well, don't you want to go in there and correct the problems in these other countries? Well, that would be a nice notion if there was any instance of us going into these other countries and actually correcting things and the outcome being what it was advertised as. Advertised. Okay? Advertising, propaganda, it's all the same stuff, guys. It's all the same stuff. And if you think that the stuff that you read is immune from this, think again. Go watch the Joe Rogan podcast where he interviewed this New York Times reporter. Okay, if you want to see just exactly how shallow the decision process is, check that out. In fact, there's a little scene there where she's discussing Tulsi Gabbard, incidentally, where she has things to say about Tulsi Gabbard. She said, Tulsi Gabbard is an Assad toady. And then Joe Rogan says, what's a toady? And she's like, Jamie, look that up for me. She didn't even know what the word meant. She didn't know what the word meant. She was parroting shit that she heard around the water cooler at the New York Times. Okay, now you read the New York Times and you think, well, this is the paper of record. I'm reading this. It's got to be legit, right? Well, when you see that that's the kind of person writing this stuff, and no offense to this young lady, I hope she figures things out. Okay, but she's doing the world a disservice. She's doing the world a disservice by not even endeavoring to be a real journalist. Okay, she's just parroting stuff. It was quite clear if you watch the way she's reacting. I don't think she's an anomaly. I don't think she's an outlier. So you've got people that are intellectually lazy, and you've got people who are actually bribed. All right, there are many well-documented cases of intelligence agencies, governments, interest groups, corporations, paying journalists to say certain things. They pay scientists to come to certain conclusions. Does this mean that all journalism is bad? That all scientists are bad? No, of course not. But you have to be aware that these phenomena exist. You've got to understand that they exist. So when you ask yourself, why do things trend? It's not always the stuff that we think it is on the surface. As marketers, we look at it and we go, what were the words that they used to make that trend more? Was the topic more inherently exciting? What was it that made that work? Those are legitimate questions, and we do have some information upon which we can base those things. We do get to, with all the data that we can analyze now, we can see that there are trends, there are tendencies for articles with certain types of phrasing. For example, when you emotionalize things, they tend to trend more. This is one of the reasons why everything is so effing hysterical now, right? People they know that if they find an emotional component, that they will get their article to trend more, and that's going to mean more notoriety for their publication. It's going to mean more notoriety for them. Probably not the word notoriety, that's a pejorative, but more fame, more they will become better known. Okay? Now, we can know some of that stuff, but what we don't see behind the scenes is who is pushing stuff. All right? I imagine that with the Pavlok article, what probably happened was that Pavlok probably found a good publicist or a good marketer, and then they manufactured that article, and then they made it sound new, and that got them more attention. Now, as long as they weren't outrightly lying, I think that's probably all within bounds. All right, if they're not claiming that the product can do something that it can't do, maybe that's okay. But you've got to protect your mind when you see this stuff. The stuff that looks new isn't always new. The stuff that looks true isn't always true. The stuff that looks serious isn't always serious. The institutions that are claiming to be objective are not always objective. In fact, I question that any of them are actually objective. Now, if you think that this is, well, man, you must be like a pro-Trump guy talking about fake news, blah, blah, blah. Well, I've been speaking about this stuff for decades. Any marketer who's paying attention has observed this stuff and known this stuff for decades. It's not a new thing. And me criticizing the media of all flavors, I'm not saying it's all, although there does tend to be, in the majority of it right now, there is a particular political leaning. Okay, but that doesn't mean that the guys on the other side of the fence are not just as egregious a lot of the time. Okay, in fact, I question almost all of it. Almost all of it. Another thing that kicks into play here is that we have confirmation bias. The people who write articles are writing stuff that supports what they believe to be true. If they see evidence to the contrary, they are going to dismiss it. This is why phrases like white fragility are so powerful. It's such an incredibly powerful and clever linguistic sleight of hand. If you do not agree with the white privilege, identity politics view of the world, well, that's just your white fragility showing, right? To demonstrate to you how facile this whole thing is, I could probably write a very serious paper about how attractive people have better advantages in life, and that any attractive person who denies their beauty privilege, well, that's just beauty fragility, right? If you don't believe in it, it's beauty fragility. It's because you're beautiful. You're trying to defend your position. It's a nice mother of all bombs, a nice indefensible crane kick that you can't come back from. You just label something that they say as a flaw of their character. It's kind of a veiled ad hom, actually. Okay? White fragility is a veiled ad hom. What is an ad hom? An ad hominem argument. Argumentum ad hominem. It's one of the well understood logical fallacies. Why do we call it a logical fallacy? Because if you base your judgment on the truth or falsehood of something based on a personal characteristic of the individual, well, it doesn't necessarily correlate. Yes, it's possible that maybe this person is a well-established liar, therefore you should not respect what they're saying. Maybe that's a good heuristic lens through which you can look at what they're saying on the whole. But it doesn't have anything to do with the truth or falsehood of their individual statements. Okay, so when they throw out the white fragility card, this is them basically saying it's your personal flaw. Any argument that you have against the white privilege orthodoxy is just your flaw. It's your individual flaw. Now, to be clear about this, am I saying that people of color don't have disadvantages? Absolutely not. They clearly have disadvantages. But here's where I disagree with most of these guys, right? Where I disagree with them is in how they intend to go about solving the problem. I don't think going around waving your finger in the face of white folks, especially white folks who experience disadvantage themselves, and saying, well, but your suffering is nothing. Your suffering is nothing, little person, unless you're one of these classes that we have recognized as people whose suffering is legitimate. Screw that. Screw that. How can anybody know what your individual suffering is? They cannot. They cannot know it. Okay, guys, that is it for today. I'll talk to you all tomorrow. I know we had a couple days that we missed there, and I'm intending to be back here fully on board from this point on. Might be a few days in August where I miss a few, but I'm back in the saddle, and I will talk to you all tomorrow.